just fine. You can keep your cameras off if that makes you feel a little better. Sometimes I don't really like looking at myself while I'm trying to learn. But I am so excited. This is something that's near and dear to Staci and I's hearts as we've been on this journey. And I'm recording this also, so if you have to leave or something happens, I'm going to send this out afterwards, so no worries about that. I've been to several of these webinars lately, and I think one of my most favorite things they do at the beginning, because we want to really model what trauma-informed is to take a moment just to kind of get ourselves ready to learn. Because I don't know if you're like me, but you may have been running around doing 50 things at one time. That's kind of how it feels these days. So just take a minute to be quiet, and I'm going to be silent for a second here too, and let myself kind of get ready to learn. And it just really helps us, I feel like. So just take a few minutes, just take a few seconds to breathe and to kind of notice your surroundings. And also in the chat box, it is really helpful if we kind of just get to know each other kind of quickly in a way that I've found to be really helpful for my students and my own children in my house, is to talk about how we're doing. And so if you don't mind just putting in what we call a rose or a thorn, or both, a rose and a thorn, which we can kind of think about it as being a high or a low for today. It just kind of gets everybody realizing, hey, we're all humans here, and we all have things that are going on outside of this space where we're learning. So if you can go ahead and do that, I'm going to take a few seconds and read some of what you have going on with your lives right now. Okay, so I see there's some sunshine. Someone's getting to work with their roommates and their best friend every day. That's so awesome. A screening interview today. That's great. Someone's going to be a grandma again. Okay, that's a really good one. A thorn, not getting to see our kiddos. Yep. And my kiddos that I teach are, between 18 and 25-ish. So, but they're still, my kids too. So I hear you on that. Getting to be a student again. Yes, I see a friend, one of our alumni from U of A on here. So hi to you. Okay, thank you for doing that. It just really helps as a teacher just to kind of get to know our students while we're doing some learning, So I just want to model that for you. Thank you for putting those in there. I'm going to look back at them too later. So I have on this call with me here Staci Graber, who's a friend of mine and a pediatric nurse locally here. And I thought we'd just start off talking about like why and how we got on this journey of being trauma informed, what that means for each of us, and just kind of why we're doing it. So I'm just going to start off with my own and just say that honestly, I just have been thinking, as I've been a classroom teacher myself and feeling, I really felt burned out only after a few years. And I just knew that there was something missing from my teaching, and I just wasn't sure what it was. And so, as life went up and down for me, and many of you know, different traumatic things have happened to me, just like traumatic things have happened to you in your lives. A lot of reflection has happened. And so, then I started teaching pre-service teachers and seeing how their stress levels really impacted their performance, not only their performance in the classroom, but also just their well-being in life, and just their the way that they were able to handle extra stress in the classroom. It was really apparent that we were needing some more support. So I joined Twitter, which I know a lot of you have different feelings about Twitter. It's a social media, I understand that, but for the way that I use it, it's really professional development. And I follow authors that I love. I follow, scholars and other researchers, and I do follow some funny people on there too. But I found a hashtag a couple of years ago that was trauma informed. That's the hashtag. And I started reading, and I just felt like I found my people. And as I started to learn more about what that looked like to be trauma informed, I realized that was the missing piece for my own teaching. And so then about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I found an online certification process that I could go through California State University to become trauma informed as a specialist, trauma informed specialist certification. And that's been transformative for me. So really that's what you're seeing here is a lot of what I've learned over the last year in those courses and applying some of the things in my own classes. So Staci, I'm going to turn it over to you. And just tell them a little bit about what you're doing right now. And your job has changed a lot, I know. So if you might want to just tell kind of what you do and then how you ended up on this trauma-informed journey.
Yeah, so I have been for the last 15 years a pediatric nurse practitioner. And what that means is I see children, sick children, and do preventative medicine for well checks in a clinical setting. And over the last 10 years or so, I've seen a lot of increase in mental health needs in the population that I have served and the patients that I see. So in the fall, I found a mental health fellowship through Ohio State University that was geared specifically for pediatric nurse practitioners and pediatricians. And I've been working on that since October and learning a whole lot. And about the same time, I, for the first time, viewed a video on adverse childhood experiences called ACEs, and saw how the experiences that children have that are traumatic, and we'll kind of go into those, can not only harm the mental health, but work on the physical body as well as they grow up. So my eyes were kind of open to, okay, this stuff really matters, and we can't ignore it any longer in the medical field. So yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, so Staci and I kind of went along this journey at the same time. So that was really interesting as we started learning more and thinking about how can we get this information out and how can we really impact our community, because that's really what my long-term goal is to really make this a systemic difference in Northwest Arkansas and Arkansas as we start binding together, across the nation with what we understand about ACEs and how it impacts our kids. So speaking of ACEs, some of you, have different understandings and levels of this. Some of you have probably taught about ACEs. Some of you have never heard of ACEs. And so one thing about this whole presentation is just take what you need and leave what you don't. So as we go through these slides here, you can kind of see some definitions that will help us kind of understand each other's language. So when we talk about trauma, there's just misconceptions, I think, a lot when we think about what trauma is. Trauma is technically, by this researcher says, trauma is an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. But what we found with the ACEs study, which you can see next there on that slide, is that it really depends on the age of a child when something traumatic happens. What is determined to be traumatic is really a personal decision, personal impact on the situation, because it really depends on how often it happens, the intensity, the frequency. What is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another, and I think that's really important to understand because we tend to, when we think about trauma, we think about just the big events. But what we've found through the research here that you'll see more on these other slides as well, is that no matter what has happened to a person, it can impact them for their entire lifetime. And it depends on their ability to bounce back or their resilience. So then you think, okay, well, I've been through, you may be thinking as you watch and learn some things today, like I've been through some traumatic events in my past, like how does that, how is it really impacting me today? And, it just depends person to person on how it's going to manifest itself. And I think for me, what I've noticed most about this whole process of becoming trauma informed, it means pay attention to what's going on inside of me, inside of my body. Why is it that I'm feeling a shortness of breath? Or why is it that I can feel my shoulders, being really tense, and just noticing that my the tenseness in our shoulders. So right now, like wherever you are, you might just take a second and think, like, what's happening in my body right now? And there's a book that I have listed on here, one of our resources, called The Body Keeps the Score. It's a really dense book, and it's a difficult book to read, but it's also, it really changed everything I thought about the way that our body really processes trauma. And so thinking about those things, what are we going to do about it? Well, we can actually build resilience. And I think this is also another misconception that a lot of people have, is that we might say, well, kids are resilient, or people are resilient. And so it ends up kind of really negating trauma. It can just really be dismissive. So thinking about resilience as a skill, and we can all have that skill. We all have the capacity to be resilient, but we need to have some things in place in order to build resilience, so that when we face trauma, when we face adversity, we can bounce back. Obviously right now, Staci and I had planned on doing this prior to the coronavirus and COVID-19. And we were really wanting everyone to be aware, because we could see this happening in our classrooms and in her office, in her clinic, the way that people are not noticing what's happening inside their bodies and really just trying to treat the effects of it. And so we really want to be more proactive. And so now with this going on with the coronavirus, it's at the forefront. So everyone is aware of it now, even if you may not have been before. And so it's really shining a light on trauma. And so I really see this as a good thing in the long run. And many of the questions that you guys submitted on the survey came back to, like, how do I make sure my kids are not traumatized by this situation that we're in right now? And, how can we come out on this on the other side? Because this is a collective trauma that we're going through. So I thought I'd let Staci talk for a second about just how you talk to your kids about the coronavirus. That was several people asked that question too. Just how can we talk to them about it in a way that's kid friendly and that really helps our kids? So Staci, would you mind talking about that?
Sure. I think one thing that you all probably know about children is that they tend to focus on themselves and their reality. And so while it's hard for them to understand necessarily what a virus is doing to the world, or the economics, or the politics, or even the medical part of it, they just know that they can't play at their friend's house, or they can't go to school. So one way that you can talk to young children specifically is just to explain that there's a new virus going around in the world that doctors and nurses haven't treated before. So we are trying to, as a community, separate to keep the spread of germs from making lots of people sick, while people in the medical community have time to do research and figure out treatment and prepare hospitals for the people that might get really sick from it. And then just focusing on what you can control. There's a whole lot you can't control, obviously. There's a whole lot we don't know. We don't know how long things will last. We don't know when they'll get to go back to school and stuff like that. But you can focus on saying, today we're going to have lunch at noon, and we're going to have dinner at 6, and after dinner we'll read a story, or we'll do something as a family, and keep the routine as routine as possible, and give them something to look forward to, and also help them know, like, well, you maybe cannot go to your neighbor's house inside, but you can talk to them through the phone, or you can write letters to grandma, or draw pictures, or use creativity and talk to the kids about what they can do in the midst of all the change.
Thank you, Staci. I'll have more questions for you in a minute. So, but thank you for that. Those are things, that Staci has talked to me about with my own kids, and it's been helpful. And it's not only helpful for our kids, it's helpful for us. And I think that's what I really hope we get out of this today, is realizing how much of this needs to come from us, and how we are keeping routines, and that we're keeping some boundaries there. and that regulates us so that it really regulates our kids. So thank you for that, Staci. Going back to, ACEs and thinking about what they are, it is very sobering when you read the research on adverse childhood experiences. They do have a tremendous impact, and they are cumulative in nature. Like I said earlier, though, after we finish this, I have, a resource page I've emailed out to you guys several times, I think. But you can locate the ACEs quiz and those kinds of things. But what I have found over the course of the year of my certification is really a less of an emphasis on this, on ACEs, because it just really varies between people on how, a score of an 8 will look very different in another person that might have an 8, just depending on the severity and when it happened. And then the buffers, the resilience factors, that is the part that really changes the game for kids and for adults. So, but at the same time, it's really useful for research and for us to get the word out that it is really important, and for parents and teachers to be aware of ACEs and what they are, so that we can really have universal trauma-informed practices in our classrooms. Because we don't know, and especially with kids, many of them are still in an adverse experience. It's not that it happened in the past, it could be happening then, or maybe they didn't have it at the beginning of the school year, and then by the middle of the year they did. And so, there's lists of different adverse experiences that you can find. They've been amended over the years to include different poverty factors and things like that. But it is good to know, like this, that it does have, cumulative effects, and it does have long-lasting effects, and it can even increase, once you start reading the research on it. It can even be worse than smoking in some situations, depending on cardiovascular disease and all kinds of different factors. So on the handout I have, there's a really amazing TED Talk, if you haven't seen it, on ACEs by Dr. Burke Harris, and she's now the Surgeon General of California, who I follow on Twitter. And she does a great job explaining this in a way that we can all understand. So you can kind of keep looking at that. So as far as, looking at the research, thinking about Arkansas. So when you start reading the research, and you may have seen in the news, Arkansas is topping the nation. And in 2016, we were at the top, and I think now we're around number 3 or 4 in the nation of having the amount and frequency. So we have about 1 in 3 children have 2 or more ACEs. So, and then you can see on the right side there, it just talks about some of the specific ACEs. These aren't all of them, but that are listed, that we are definitely higher in Arkansas than we are nationwide. So for like a parent serving time in jail, we're at 16%, whereas the nation is at 8%. Of course, the economy and domestic violence and the family divorce and separation is higher here in Arkansas than the nationwide percentages. So it is, it's good for us to know that this is right here. It's right in our backyard, and for us to be knowledgeable. It's important. I cannot be more passionate about us understanding who our kids are. And this is a good way to get the word out that we do have it. We really have our own epidemic going on in our schools with our kids. So then, talking more about resilience, because that is what is really going to change it for our kids. Our counselors in our schools do an amazing job of teaching the social emotional learning curriculum. But what I have found is it really falls flat because I remember being there before I learned about the neuroscience, before I understood the biology behind what's happening in our bodies. I would teach the SEL curriculum, but it wasn't with an ownership for myself. And until I started understanding that part of it, it really does not translate for kids. And so that's why, today we really want to talk about building our own capacity for resilience and how that really translates for our kids. So yes, when you build resilience, you can negate the negative factors of ACEs, and that is powerful. So we can really get stuck talking about ACEs when really we need to focus on the resilience part. So it does act as a buffer. One thing if you don't mind, Staci, I might have you jump in here too, but just as teachers, we're in the classroom, and a lot of times we recognize, or we're the first time we might recognize that there's kids that have behaviors that look like ADHD. And the more research that I read, it looks like it is being misdiagnosed, whereas it really may be just a sign of trauma. Do you have any advice for us as teachers in classrooms? What is it that we need to do maybe beforehand, before we refer them on to medical professionals for us as teachers? Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing you can do is realize that a behavior is a symptom, and inattention and hyperactivity can be a symptom of a lot of different things. We've talked about trauma. It can also be a symptom of poor nutrition, sleep deprivation, and it can also be a symptom of the child is unable to control their home life and they feel out of control. So they do what they can to try to control their school environment. So if you recognize that behavior is a symptom, instead of it being a defiance to your authority, it may just be a way that they are presenting themselves and trying to control. And then that allows you, I think, to have some empathy and see them as a whole person and not necessarily as just a symptom. While it can be a brain chemical imbalance, it can also be a lot of other things. Actually, anxiety and depression can mimic the signs of inattention and hyperactivity as well. A lot of kids that are depressed, adults often are very down, but children are often very hyperactive when they're actually depressed or tired or hungry. So I think that empathy is really good. And you can explore a little bit, ask good questions, and try to figure out what's going on at home as their teacher. You may also be the person in their life who is the most able to build resilience in them. So you have as a teacher or a nurse or a healthcare provider, you have a very unique responsibility and unique opportunity to try to figure out what's going on and help them.
Thank you. So I just wonder, when you're, if you have a parent come in to, which I know happens, to your clinic, and they say that teachers have seen signs of ADHD, can you walk us a little bit through what you might ask and how that might look?
We do a lot of social history taking and just talk about what is home life, what is their behavior life, what are their sleep patterns, what are their eating patterns, and then all sorts of mood questions and observations from parents and teachers that go into that initial ADHD or mental health diagnosis. So there's a lot of things that go into it other than just in the classroom. But it is important to get a teacher's perspective, because those behaviors often come out in the classroom, but they usually come out at home as well.
Thank you. So I think for us, when we're thinking about our own kids, and I'm thinking about in this collective trauma experience that we're having right now, my own children at home, if they had some behaviors that, were typical of not having self-control and those kinds of things, they seem to be exacerbated now. Would you say, I'm still talking to you, Staci, too, but that's I would say typical, based on my trauma-informed certification learning and my own research, is that when families and communities are under pressure and under crisis, that behaviors like that will intensify. So have you seen that, or have you experienced that as your clinic has kind of undergone this huge change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when routines change and kids especially feel stress from parents, their behaviors will come out in very interesting ways, and it's different per child. Some will be clingy, some will be not as responsive to you, some will act out and have meltdowns. But a lot of that, I think, is just a symptom of them feeling like they know things aren't quite right, but they can't express exactly how they feel, so they act out. So one of my favorite sayings is kids do well if they can. Some kids just lack the skills to have appropriate behavior. And then sometimes stress just leads them to not be able to control their behavior. So seeing those behaviors and realizing that they are just a symptom of something else going on makes you more empathetic and able to be a little bit more proactive instead of just reactive to their behavior.
Yeah, I like that you keep coming back to empathy, because I know that for myself, I'm under, thinking about myself, trying to keep, I have a job. I'm glad that I still have a job, and also trying to get the kids their schooling that they need, meeting all those kind of different needs that pop up that you're not even expecting. It just seems like it changes day to day, that I have to really remember to do the things that make sure that I'm putting my oxygen mask on first, and that I'm being regulated, because I am at a highly irritable state is how I feel right now, where just little things can trigger. And so trigger is a word that we hear a lot when you're reading about trauma and our body's response. And so, as Staci was saying, having empathy for what is the function behind the behavior. And so I made this little chart to kind of explain my thinking on how this goes. And Staci, you can tell me if I got something wrong on here. But when you're thinking about something something triggers your amygdala, which is in the middle part of your brain. And when I started learning with the brain, I felt like everything just kind of clicked into place with how our emotions are tied to our bodies. And it just made me realize there are physical, tangible reasons and ways that the really counting breaths and breathing and doing some of those things that you're supposed to do, but we just don't really do, or we might teach our kids to do it, but we don't think about doing it for ourselves. And so that's what I'm having to be reminded to do, especially now that I feel like I wake up in a heightened state, because there is, and I put on here, it's a perceived threat, because our body doesn't differentiate between what's perceived and what isn't. It's just whatever seems different. So I was reading right before I came on here because I wanted to make sure I, had what I wanted to on the slide, and I was thinking about what our body is pumping out with that amygdala right now is something is different, and so we are at that. Hey, there's something wrong. Something is wrong when it's different in our brain, and that is the way that our brain was designed to react to threat. So it's to keep us safe. And so stress is actually a good thing. It makes us, actually get out of bed and do things and eat and work. But when the stress level is higher, that the hormones, I keep using this fist, I think I have a picture of it in a minute, but of the brain, it really helps kids to have a concrete picture. But the amygdala is in the middle part of the brain, and that's where it pumps out that hormone that tells us, like, we need to do something. So I'm either going to fight, or I'm going to flight, or I may freeze. And I've heard of fight or flight for years and years, but I hadn't heard of the freeze part. And when I started reading about the freeze, I thought, well, that's really a lot of the response that I have personally in traumatic situations. That doesn't mean that it's like highly traumatic. It could be just that I feel a sense of threat to me in some way. But then that means that our bodies are staying in this spot where then our brain cannot rationally think about what to do next. And so it looks like a behavior response, which is kind of what I have on the bottom part here. Now, as adults, we know it's not socially acceptable to push and roughhouse, or, maybe we do. Hiding under a table, I think, maybe we're hiding in our closets these days as adults, I don't know, to get away. But these responses do look different, of course, from kids to adults. But it just manifests differently. And so it can even look like compliance, which I think is a real unique one there. There's so many aspects to this, you guys, and I know I'm talking really quickly, but that we could really dive deep into. So if there's something that you want, take some notes. We have some time for questions at the end too. And I have all kinds of resources for each of these type of responses too. But it's interesting when you think about compliance as being a traumatic response. It could be a trauma response. But then what happens is we may have these uninformed, I called them uninformed responses, where okay, they weren't compliant with what they were doing, and so it looks like a misbehavior, so I clip it down. Well, if I didn't know better and I wasn't recognizing the signs, that then, like we all know as teachers, can just totally escalate it. So you always have a few kids where those behavior charts just don't work. It actually does the opposite. And that's because the way their body responds is going to be different. Some kids are in that fight, some kids are in the flight, and some are in the freeze. And so it just doesn't necessarily work for them. I put a few other things on there. I was going to have Staci talk, but I think I'll go to the next slide on this one. So now I know there's a lot of print on this, but I always really, when I look at it, I just find it fascinating, because when I think about what our body's doing with our brain and the hormones and where it goes, so we want to be in this, stasis spot where our sympathetic nervous system is going along the way that it needs to. And we have that joy. Stress does cause these things. So stress is not always a bad thing. It causes us to be compassionate and mindful and grounded and all those things. But then when there is something that has caused something different that is a threat to us happens, we can enter these other stages and it can look like panic, fear, worry, rage, irritation. I'm just stuck right there in that irritation spot, I think. But it depends on the day. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes the hour. And then you can see at the top here, it's the freeze spot where you can numb out, dissociate. You can feel hopeless. It's this overwhelmed place. And then when you deactivate and you start coming back down. So how do we deactivate? And that's going to be some of the slides I have next is, how do we deactivate and come out of that back into that stasis spot? Staci did a great job explaining this to me. So this is called, if you want to look it up, the polyvagal theory. And I think that's on the slide handout that I have for you guys too. But the polyvagal theory, and it just talks about how our brain is attached to the rest of our body, and then how our organs and our responses come down from the chemicals from our brain down, and how it affects us. Staci, would you care to say just a little bit what you did to me about the difference between that sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system?
So the sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight or freeze. So it's very complicated, but to make it super easy, there's an amygdala part of your brain, and it's telling your body basically to run from a bear in the forest. So if you are in trouble, your amygdala gears up and you get that fight or flight sympathetic nervous system response, which is great if you're in the forest with the bear. But let's take the pandemic, for example, and you have a constant state of lack of control or fear or unknown. And there is this unknown bear in the forest that you're constantly being seen with, like in your brain. So your amygdala is on hyperdrive and your sympathetic nervous system is on hyperdrive for a long period of time is similar to what the ACEs is the chronic stress. When you get that sympathetic nervous system going over a long period of time with some traumatic events or with a pandemic, then your brain just gets really tired, and it's not leaving room for the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of your brain that is supposed to rest and digest, is what we call it. And that can just lead to some of the physical things that come with chronic stress. And so what we do to trick the amygdala in a way is I always teach kids to do the deep breathing techniques. And it's basically when your amygdala is overreacting, like in the form of anxiety in some people, by the deep breathing, you're basically tricking your amygdala to knowing there's not a real threat, or we're fighting the threat that may chronically be there, like the pandemic. So in hopes that your sympathetic nervous system will not be on hyperdrive forever and cause you permanent damage.
That was awesome. You did a great job at that. Yeah, so realizing that we can talk to ourselves and for our kids, I keep saying ourselves because this was the process that I feel like I went through when I started learning this, is like, wow, I can really think about consciously change our thought pattern in the moment to say what is really truly happening here, what is true, not what the story that I'm making up in my head is. Because we get in that anxious spot where then we really cannot function well. So this next slide is a little bit funny, I think. Not funny, but it's very, I think it just tells real specifically, what happens on both sides of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So thinking about how all of those organs and how our body, it reacts to stress should put us all on notice that we need to be aware of what stressors we have in our life. Is it a healthy stress level? Is it not a healthy? And really, during this time of a pandemic, I mean, it is for me, an hourly kind of check-in with myself, and to have a support system of other people. How are you doing? And have you been outside today? And are you, moving your body in some way? And you can see how when you start doing that and start working out or doing something that will kind of change the way that your thought pattern has kind of gotten into this rut, it really does have a full body effect. And so I know when I'm doing better, then my kids are doing better. Has anyone ever noticed that before? So for teachers, I think it's really important. And so this chart always just really fascinates me because it looks very simple. And then you realize, and my little screen's kind of covering up the bottom part here, but hopefully you can see it. When you have a regulated adult, it always equals a regulated child. But if you have a dysregulated adult and a regulated child, it ends up becoming a dysregulated child. This, to me, is very sobering. And it makes me really think hard about the decisions that I make in my classroom, the decisions I make even about assignments, about my classroom management. It makes me think, as a parent, about the things, we say this a lot in education, but we say that teachers are really the weather makers of the classroom. This, to me, is a really good representation of that. Is children can be all kinds of different ways, but the adult really has to take charge of their own response, their own regulation in order to have a regulated child or classroom of kids. Okay, so, some keys here to building resilience, because that's what we want to do. Now that we know some of the biology and we looked at some of and I'll show you another picture of the brain in a minute. What can we do? So learning to recognize our own response. So what is going on in my body right now, and why am I having that? And just being conscious about it. Recognizing when we're triggered by children's response to their stress. So we may feel like we're regulated. We had our quiet time, workout time, whatever you want to call it, and then we come into the room. I'm thinking it was a parent here, and then a kid is flipping out. What happens within us, when that child is flipping out? So what do we have to do as an adult is to regulate ourselves again in order to regulate the child. And I'll have a slide in a minute to help us with that. But really, for me, it has been practicing my own resilience building and taking time to reflect on decisions I make. And if that also has to do, when I think about my own kids, with punishment and rewards and those things too. Like what am I really doing? Why is the child acting the way they are? Because they do not have the same prefrontal cortex that we have as adults. They don't have all the rational thinking. And so, like Staci mentioned, they're going to act out in different ways that are not going to be the ones that we would choose or want them to choose. But that's their way of using language. They just don't have the language that we have to describe things. So they're going to act out, and it's going to look like misbehavior. So this is one of my favorite concrete ways to explain this to kids and to myself. And I know I kept trying to do this earlier to you guys, and hopefully you can see me here. But all I'm doing is closing my fingers over my thumb here as a fist. And so thinking about the brain this way really helps give a concrete representation to kids and to myself when I think about how it feels when I'm flipping my lid. And so when you say, I'm about to flip my lid, like my kids know what that means. If I say I'm about to flip my lid, they know that I'm having some sort of trigger trauma response situation that I need to calm myself down. So we kind of have that language. But if you teach your kids this, it can really help. But thinking about our brain stem back here is our reptilian part of the brain. If you have done Choose Love, I think they call it that way in that curriculum too. But it's making decisions like we talked about, the fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, so we want to keep ourselves safe. So that's going to be here. And the front part of our brain here is this prefrontal cortex, which is the last thing to develop in a brain or in the brain. And it really doesn't finish, from what I've read, until you're about 25, 26 years old, somewhere in there. So you know, this is still developing, but this is your rational thought, your executive functioning, how you make decisions, how to metacognitively think about the emotions that you're having and what to do next. So when the amygdala starts pumping out its hormones to say, hey, something is wrong here, you can call it flipping your lid, which means in the prefrontal cortex, the rational thought part is no longer talking to the bottom part of our brain anymore. So we are flipped. So the goal then is, okay, how can I get this part back down to here? How can I get this part of my brain talking to the lower part of my brain again? I want my top part of my brain to tell my bottom part it's going to be okay. We have food, we have a place to sleep, you know, whatever it may be that you need to tell yourself to kind of get your lid flipped back down into this spot really is helpful. I put on here breathing in, breathing out, because that's the thing you're always going to have with you. So, you know, we always talk about different strategies and tools. Well, you're always going to have your breathing with you. And thinking about different ways of concretely showing kids. And I think about it myself too. There's a couple of things I've learned about this that is really critical. I always thought, okay, well, breathe in for 3, out for 3, or something like that. But what research has shown is that you need to breathe in, you need to breathe out double the time that you take breathing in. So if I breathe in 1, 2, 3, then I need to breathe out 6. Because that's the part that tells your brain to calm down. It's the part that tells your nervous system to calm back down again. And so I encourage all of y'all to do it right now. But to breathe in for 3 through your nose, and then out 6. Or maybe you need 5 and 10. So thinking about it, or, you know, and having physical, you think about blowing up the balloon for a kid, and you know, and doing it slowly like that. Because one thing, you know, when the kids are really amped up, it's hard for them to think about breathing right then. So I've also seen it where you can do it like this, where you're breathing in and out while you're tracing your finger. And it just gives them a concrete way to think about something else rather than what it is that they're flipping their lid about. So thinking about breathing that way is really helpful. So another way that I've heard psychologists talk about this is it's a hijack. Your amygdala has been hijacked. And so you need redirection strategies. Grounding yourself. And I know it sounds a little bit funny, but it really does work if you've never tried these things before. But when you are feeling like, you know, and for adults, we sometimes call them like panic attacks or just anxiety attacks or just something that's overwhelming you. This came from a question that you guys had. I put this slide together. What can you do right then? You know, and it depends on the situation. I'm not going to use humor in every situation. That may not be a very empathetic reaction, but sometimes for kids, that is something that I can do to kind of redirect a kiddo when you know they're not really hurt. Something they're just overwhelmed with something that I might just really want to act silly or turn on music, do something different to kind of just change the surrounding. But even just thinking about yourself in your chair and thinking about what your feet feel like in your shoes, what the chair feels like, what you notice around you, using your senses. The amygdala in the brain is right next to where our smell center is, where we keep our memories. And memory and smell and the amygdala are all just right here in the middle. So if you can use essential oils or some other smell, especially with kiddos, but essential oils are great for me too. It can really take you out of the place where you feel like your brain, you know, has flipped, and bring you back down into a different grounded spot. So it really helps. And then, you know, stretching or you know, stretching always really feels good and changes the way that your body is reacting to, or squeezing, you know, and using pressure. So those are just some ideas I had for that. So here at the last bit of what we're doing, I thought we might think about questions that we have, and also just when we know better, we do better. We started our teacher preparation program this year with this quote. Jennifer, I know that you remember that. Back in the fall, we did not know what was coming this year. We did not expect a pandemic. But at the same time, I know that teachers have really been doing a lot of these things that we probably have said today. But sometimes you just need the affirmation and the confirmation of what you're doing. But it can also, I know for me, it just really changes it to know the brain part and the neuroscience behind it, what our bodies are doing. What else we can do is read. Okay, I'm a reader. So some things that have helped me a ton. The Deepest Well is the TED Talk that's going to be on this. I think my sister is putting it in the chat. I think she's in here maybe. A link to our resource page. But The Deepest Well is there, and there's a TED Talk that she gave, and that book came out about a year later. And it's a good read. Like it's like a story. It's not overwhelming. Body Keeps the Score there, that fourth one. That one is not a fast read, and it's not for the faint of heart, and I wouldn't really recommend it for audio either. I would, you really want to kind of go slow with it, and it does deal with a lot with PTSD in the beginning with veterans, which is sad, but also fascinating. It's real deep. Towards the end there, it really becomes a little more applicable, but it was fascinating. Trauma stewardship is one I really want to highlight here. I've noticed a few people across our campus at U of A use it in their courses, occupational therapy and the counseling ed people use it. You can get it on Amazon, and we use it in my class. So one thing that I really see coming is that teachers they always needed support. They need extra support now coming into the fall. Things are going to need to change. And so one thing that if you guys can start Googling or looking for when you do the hashtag trauma informed is reflective supervision. And it's a process of really what you want to say that it's not therapy, but it kind of feels like a group therapy. And we did it through Zoom all year before we even knew Zoom was a thing. And there'd just be a few of us in, and we would just talk about things that are going on. Because what I want teachers to know is you guys, every teacher that cares feels a lot of stress. If you care, then you're doing the right thing. You feel stress. But we need support, and we need different kinds of support than we've ever needed before. So I don't want us to feel like we're going back to business as usual in August. I hope that we're going back in August, but we're going to need some extra support. The teachers are. So I have some ideas on that, but there's some other things here you can see. I'm going to let you guys kind of ask some questions. One thing, I was reading through your survey questions that you submitted, and I just felt like I had to put this little note here right at the end, right before we started, but this is crisis schooling. It is not online teaching. Online teaching is, it takes a long time to learn, and it takes, it's not what we're doing. So you guys are doing an amazing job. You need to take care of your own mental health. I know from my own kids, their teachers, they've just been so supportive and telling us, and I know the administrators are telling you things, and you need to tell things, and the parents are all under a lot of stress. So everyone needs an extra layer of grace, I feel like right now, and just to really take care of ourselves. The kids, once they know that you care about them, the learning happens, and you guys know that that we can do this together. So I just wanted to put that on here. I also been reading some neat things about post-traumatic growth. Doesn't that sound awesome? So, we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress, but there is there's real documentation of post-traumatic growth for society and for communities after big events. I mean, a lot of us know 9/11 and how that felt. This is very different, but at the same time, there were changes that happened that were positive, and they're documented, so you can look into that too. But okay, so I talked a whole lot there at the end, and Staci's still here with us, and I'm sure I forgot something I was going to ask her, but if you want to unmute yourself, if you want to be on video, you can turn on, but you don't have to. I can't really see everybody, but if anybody wants to ask a question, this would be a great time for it. Is there chat? I haven't even looked in the chat. Okay, there's a quiz. So here's a question. Um, let's see, I'll have 6th and 8th grade students in the fall during the first couple of days. What different support methods should I address? What's going on? So, I mean, and Staci, you can speak to this too. I think the most important thing in this is to not pretend like something didn't happen. You know, the kids, I mean, they're way aware, especially sixth through 8th grade, and they have social media and all those kinds of things. So we're going to have to really think about strategies for helping them express themselves. I'm picturing it. If you guys know, if you're teachers, you know what morning meeting looks like. I'm thinking about morning meeting like exponential size. We're gonna need to have that time to talk and process together, to really build that community. It's things that I think we all do the first few weeks, or first week of school maybe, but we're gonna have to do it longer and with more fidelity. Is what I'm seeing, and not only that, but also the professional development leading up to that. I am envisioning that the teachers are going to need something different. We're going to need supports for teachers coming back, and I know your administrators, many of them, are trauma informed, but if they're not, then let them know about these resources out here. I'd be happy to talk to anyone that wants to talk about it as well. Let's see, does resiliency have to be built before a trauma occurs? That's a great question. Staci, you might want to weigh on this too. The question is, does resiliency have to be built before a trauma occurs in order to act as a buffer, or can it be built afterward with the same effectiveness? I'm so glad you asked this question. I did not even mention the word neuroplasticity, and that's a fun one to say, and your kids are going to love it. Okay, now I'm having like all these thoughts. That's another thing I feel like we can really tap into for our kids coming back. Even as young as kindergarten, they love to learn about the brain. And so we need to really teach them about what I just taught us and what we know now about our brain. I want all of us to have pictures of brains up in our classroom and talk about, like, this is what you're feeling and this is why, and that's normal and that's good. That means that you're alive and it means your body's working, that you have this stress. So my short answer to you, Shelby, would be both. I mean, if you can have it before, you can imagine that you will have, maybe, it depends on the situation for sure, a quicker bounce back, or you just have more resources. You just know, okay, this is what my brain's doing, this is why, and this is normal to feel like I don't have any energy. It's normal to feel like I don't have an appetite. A lot of things I'm saying here may sound like grief. I mean, this to me, and there's a great article that went around that's saying, what everyone's feeling right now is grief. And there's a good article for that too. So really, either way, definitely after, because we know that even up until we die, we can continue to create neurons firing in our brain in different ways and create new neural pathways. That's kind of a whole nother presentation I'd love to do on another day. Someone said Google the Brain House. So that's a great lesson. Thank you, Sarah. So everyone needs to Google that. I'm not sure I can read these fast enough does anyone want to, someone can unmute themselves and say something.
Could you talk a little bit more about compliance and what that looks like at home or in the classroom?
Okay, so compliance, you're gonna, like, how much time do we have? So compliance is a really interesting one to think about, because the way that I think about it is the kids sometimes that just follow all the rules all the time, and they don't really have an affect that is strong either way. They kind of just stay like this all the time. It's almost, I wonder if I can go back to that slide, but I don't want to say comatose, but it can look like that's just the way they've learned to cope, And so I know in some of my training and SEL training, we are taught, when you make a list of kids, if you make a quick list of your kids in your class at the beginning of the year, probably not towards the end, but who is it that you leave off, or who is it that doesn't really stand out? Those kids, we're not saying that they've been traumatized or anything like that, but it's just something to pay attention to, that perhaps they're at a place where it's like, I've got to follow the rules, or else, kind of a feeling about them. I have a lot, if you want to email me, I have my email here. I can send you some more, because we can start talking a little bit about compliance in a way that, like, for instance, and if you've done these things, it's okay. Know better we know better, we do better. But for like these Zoom chats and things, I've heard about teachers across the nation. And I know there's reasons behind it, but they're saying they cannot be eating or drinking while they're on Zoom, or they need to dress a certain way while they're on Zoom, or, those kinds of things are like compliant. That is it really necessary? Like, it's not showing flexibility there. It's just something to consider. Why is it that we're having the rules that we have? Yeah, I could talk probably quite a bit more about that, but thank you for that question. What other questions do we have? Got a couple minutes left. I'm trying to read these, but at the same time. Does anyone have? Yeah.
Bonnie, this is Chris Gearing. I just wanted to say thank you. This has been so fantastic. It's really named a lot of the things that I've been experiencing kind of since the closure with COVID-19 and being with my children every day. And then just also some of the feelings that I've had about work in the midst of all that. So thank you so much, both. And this is what a terrific thing. And the timing ended up being better than you could have ever imagined.
Yeah, exactly.
We all needed this.
Thank you, Chris, for that. I really appreciate it. I mean, something that, as I was doing this and wanting to do it on campus. So we were originally going to do this with pre-service nurses and pre-service teachers, and just to kind of get this conversation started. And well, then everything blew up, and the nurses, I don't know if we have many on here, because a lot of them that I was talking to went ahead and got emergency certified, and different things happened. And so they were able to go ahead and start working now. And so it really did change. It changed everything. But then I have to look on the, when I say that post-traumatic growth, we are going to be looking at our systems and our rules and our, going back to that compliance thing. And I'm probably going to step on a toe here, and I probably shouldn't. But when we talk about zero tolerance policies, I wonder how you all feel about those. As we start thinking about kids and the decision making, their prefrontal cortex is not all the way developed, and they make decisions that aren't necessarily the right ones. And so for us to have zero tolerance, that's another example of, like, maybe we should look at that again. What does that really look like, and what does that really mean? Another thing, like, we're going there now, Chris, you just got me going. But these active shooter drills, I know that we wanted to do those for safety reasons, but is it causing trauma where there doesn't need to be? We already have kids in this heightened sense of, in their homes, or something isn't safe, and then we're going to come to school and put them in a situation that definitely doesn't feel safe. So, and I'm, that's like a whole nother conversation, but it's just, that's kind of where, thinking about how our systems may change. Thank you so much. What else do we have? If someone sees a question on here they want answered, go ahead and read it off, even if it's not yours, because I'm kind of getting behind. Thank you. Yeah, someone else said on here they needed to hear that. You guys that are teachers and trying to teach your own kids at home, like, you bring tears to my eyes, because I just feel there's just a lot of guilt, I feel, because even my seventh grader, so I have a seventh grader, a fourth grader, and a kindergartner. There's a lot of grief because they, missed the end of, they didn't get to say bye to their elementary school, and he's going to middle school. And there's so much grief involved. And then not only that, like, I'm having to shove one of them almost in a closet with a computer to get her stuff done, so that the other one can have room to work. And and I have resources, and I have this, as a teacher, we have such a, love for our students. We want to do the right thing. So I want to do the right thing by my college students online. But then what about my kids right here who, I'm having to tell them to be quiet and move to the other room, and this is not normal situation. So wherever we can, if you need to get outside, like, set boundaries for yourself. And I'm telling myself the same thing. So I think we got 2 more minutes. Does anyone else have anything? Staci's still here too. So I feel like there was a couple of questions, but I'm getting behind on my chat.
So I did have a question. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Oh, who was talking? Is it my turn, or who?
You go for it.
Okay, so I have I'm running into some situations where I'd be very interested in What are some approaches that can be recommended for situations where some experiences are a trigger for someone that's experienced something very traumatic? And so, but the family members that are surrounding that individual, and so the person that experienced it is attending to them, doing the breathing, following everything that has been recommended, but the family members that have never been treated for any of their trauma sometimes make stabbing remarks or aren't necessarily so like that parent just basing it off that PowerPoint, but it's where they live. So I going to people's homes, you see that a lot. And so what are some of the things that you can recommend for someone like me that's involved in how to help them in a situation when, because a lot of these people aren't, they might be 12, they might be 13, they might be up to the age of 18, but still having to live in that every day.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. Staci, I'm going to let you jump in here too, or at the end of this, and maybe you can also say what you think. It really depends on the age of the kid that we're talking about. So when you're talking with those older kids, they do have quite a bit of agency at that point where they can, understand situations, they can learn. So giving them these tools and letting them know that there are supports and what those supports look like, that's what's so, gosh, it's so hard when I hear you say that schools really were doing so much and now everyone knows it. We were providing Wi-Fi, internet, technology, food, safety, place, all those things that we know that we were doing. Now the world's seeing it. And now that's not there. So we're really having, with the situation we're in now, we're going to have to just make sure that we're getting at least hearing from those kids. If we're not, then we're going to have to think to the next level, how are we going to, do some welfare checks. But I didn't know, Staci, did you want to respond to that?
I would probably just encourage you to see if you can figure out where that person's safe place is, what other individual is there for them that they could talk to that is not bringing out negativity, and encourage them to go to their safe place and just realize that the family member that is being negative or not understanding, that's their own way of grieving as well. And that's coming probably from a place of potential trauma from them too. So just the more you can encourage people to go with the coping mechanisms that they know and go to their people that provide them support, I think is the best you can do. And there's a resource on the email that Bonnie sent you, I think, that's a little acrostic for cope with COVID, and it just talks through a lot of the things that we've talked through, and how to help your kids with that, how to help your students with that, and then how to do it yourself primarily first. Like she said, putting your oxygen mask on first before you try to help others, to make sure you're coming from a place of health yourself. But those are hard situations to be in, for sure. Thank you for the work that you're doing.
For sure. Yeah, I really like that. I mean, it's that book that I had, that trauma stewardship book. Let me go back. Oh, thought I could. It talks about all the different ways people have a response to trauma, and it can look so different. And so I'm glad that you said that. That's whoever that is their response to their trauma. And so teaching kids about all the different ways that trauma can look, well, then they're able to recognize it. It makes it not about them anymore, because that's what kids do. They internalize it. They think this is about me, and this is, because they're so egocentric. So, giving them those tools and also just whenever we can. Oh, I'm so glad this came to me. I read this, and I always this is what I want my mantra to be, is that when I think about kids, I want it to be unconditional positive rapport, unconditional positive respect for kids. That they are acting as the best what was it, Staci, you said they'll act the best they can. Is that, you said it better? What did you say?
Kids do well when they can.
Kids do well when they can. That unconditional positive regard, I think that's the word, unconditional positive regard. when I keep that in mind, and really it needs to be that for adults too. It's just a lot harder with adults because, you want to hold them to a higher, level of expectation. But at the same time, parents, all these parents are really doing the best they can with the resources that they have, even though it definitely may not look like the way that you would want it to. They just don't know. And so I just like Staci said, thank you for the work that you're doing. There's not an easy answer to that, but take care of yourself. That's what I was trying to get to, is on that trauma stewardship book is about, you are a steward of trauma. Like, you are one of those advocates. And so you need to take care of yourself first and foremost. So I think we're over time now. If there's anything else, like I have my email on there. Was there another question or something? Okay. So this is my passion, and I have to have boundaries myself, of course. So, I'm trying to do better about that, but it's hard because I'm not able to do what I usually do during the day. So it ends up being at night, but I'm going to, I'll try to be, but I am really passionate about this, and I want to continue this conversation. This is just a jumping off, like, let's just get some language out there in our community and work together because we're going to need it. I already thought that before and then the pandemic happened. And so now we all just know, right? So take care of yourselves. Thank you for coming. It's just encouraging and to know we're all out here and we're all wanting the best for our kids and for our families and for the people that we love. So thank you. I think you have the link, and I'll send out this recording. I know not everyone was able to come, but thank you so much. And Jennifer, Office of Teacher Ed, thank you all for supporting us so well. Jake, thank you. I see some people waving. Thanks.